December 10th, 1941. The South China Sea. Able seaman Simon Doughty clung to a vibrating rail on the deck of HMS Prince of Wales. She wasn't just a ship, she was a 35,000-ton statement of British resolve. A brand-new King George V-class battleship, the absolute pinnacle of a century of naval engineering, she carried the scars of her recent battle with the German behemoth, Bismarck. Next to her, the legendary battle cruiser HMS Repulse sliced through the waves, her sleek, powerful lines a symbol of an empire's global reach, a veteran of the Great War. Together, they were Force Z, an unsinkable squadron dispatched by Winston Churchill himself as a stark, steel-clad warning to deter Japanese aggression in Malaya. They were the physical embodiment of sea power, their combined 19 heavy guns capable of hurling shells the weight of a small car over 20 miles with pinpoint accuracy. For 4 centuries, ships just like these had been the final arbiters of global power, the queens of the ocean chessboard. At 11:13 a.m., the lookouts screamed, their voices laced not with the familiar fear of an enemy fleet, but with confusion. The threat was not the dreaded silhouettes of Japanese warships on the horizon, but something else entirely. A swarm of buzzing insects low on the water. They were Japanese G-3M Nell and G-4M Betty twin-engine bombers, land-based aircraft dispatched from airfields in occupied French Indochina, hundreds of miles away. On the bridge, Admiral Sir Tom Phillips, a staunch and respected battleship admiral, had dismissed the threat. He had refused air cover from the RAF, famously stating that bombers are no match for battleships. His entire career, his entire understanding of naval warfare was built on the unshakable trinity of the gun, armor, and speed. The logic, honed over decades, was simple. No airborne weapon could penetrate the thick, hardened deck armor of a modern battleship. For the men on the decks, that deeply held confidence quickly curdled into disbelief, then cold professional readiness, and finally, sheer terror. The first wave of high-level bombers dropped their payloads. The sea erupted in colossal waterspouts as the bombs missed, drenching the decks in a biblical deluge. For a moment, it seemed the admiral was right. The ships were invulnerable from above. Then came the torpedo bombers. They swept in low and fast, like predatory birds, their pilots expertly trained for years in this exact type of attack. They ignored the storm of anti-aircraft fire from the ship's multiple pom-pom guns, a blizzard of lead that seemed to have no effect. Doughty watched in horror as a torpedo, a tiny weapon against such a giant, slammed into the Repulse. Then another hit his own ship. The magnificent Prince of Wales, designed to withstand shell fire from the mightiest warships, shuddered violently as a single Type 91 torpedo struck its port stern. The hit was impossibly, catastrophically precise. The 2.5-ton propeller shaft, spinning at high speed, bent and buckled, acting like a giant flail inside the ship. It tore a huge, irreparable gash in the hull, allowing a torrent of seawater to pour in. The hit disabled the rudder and, crucially, flooded the generators. In an instant, the state-of-the-art battleship was rendered a crippled, wallowing target, its electrically powered gun turrets falling silent, its defenses crippled. What happened over the next hour was not a battle. It was a methodical, scientific slaughter. Crippled and unable to evade, the 2 capital ships were swarmed by wave after wave of aircraft. They were gored by torpedoes and pummeled by bombs, their thick armor proving useless against attacks that struck at their vulnerable underbellies and from the sky. At 12:33 p.m., HMS Repulse, having absorbed 5 torpedo hits, capsized and sank in just 6 minutes. Less than an hour later, the magnificent Prince of Wales, the ship that had carried Winston Churchill to draft the Atlantic Charter with Roosevelt, followed her to the bottom. 840 British sailors were dead. The Japanese lost 3 aircraft. When Churchill was informed, he later wrote, "In all the war, I never received a more direct shock."
What Admiral Phillips and the world's navies failed to grasp in that horrific moment was that this was more than the loss of 2 ships. It was the public execution of an entire era of warfare. For 400 years, the battleship had been the undisputed queen of the seas. What the Japanese pilots proved that day was that the queen was naked and her reign was over. A new weapon had arrived, one that didn't need to match armor with armor or guns with guns. It attacked from over the horizon, projecting power not in miles, but in hundreds of miles. This is the story of how the aircraft carrier, a vessel dismissed by traditionalists as a fragile, experimental auxiliary, violently dethroned the battleship, and in doing so, didn't just change naval warfare, it rewrote its very laws. The battleship's reign was not merely a matter of naval strategy. It was the physical manifestation of an industrial empire's power, a global doctrine written in steel and fire. Its logic, forged in the age of sail at battles like Trafalgar and perfected in the roaring steel furnaces of the Industrial Revolution, was simple and brutal. The bigger the guns and the thicker the armor, the more powerful the ship. This philosophy was given its intellectual foundation by the American naval theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan, whose writings argued that national greatness was inextricably linked to sea control, and sea control could only be achieved by a fleet of capital ships capable of seeking out and destroying an enemy's fleet in a single, decisive battle. This Mahanian doctrine led to a naval arms race that culminated in behemoths of almost unimaginable power. There was the German Bismarck, a masterpiece of engineering, whose breakout into the Atlantic in 1941 triggered a desperate, full-scale hunt that captivated the world. A single ship holding the entire British home fleet hostage. And then there was the ultimate, almost mythical expression of the type, the Japanese superbattleship Yamato. Her very existence was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Displacing a staggering 72,000 tons, her main belt armor was over 16 inches of hardened steel, angled to deflect even the heaviest shells. She mounted 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever made, housed in 3 turrets that each weighed more than an entire destroyer. These guns were capable of firing 3,200-pound armor-piercing shells, the weight of a Volkswagen Beetle, over 26 miles, with the aid of the world's most advanced optical rangefinders. The Yamato was more than a warship. She was a floating fortress, a symbol of Japanese martial spirit, a national deity of steel so powerful that her mere existence was intended to shape foreign policy and deter the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet. In this world of fire-breathing leviathans, the aircraft carrier was an awkward, unproven upstart. The first carriers, like the USS Langley, affectionately nicknamed the Covered Wagon, were converted from colliers and other ships. Her flight deck was a fragile wooden platform, her top speed a pathetic 15 knots, and her aircraft were flimsy biplanes. To the battleship admirals who ruled the world's navies, these ships were a joke. Their entire culture, their decades of training revolved around the complex mathematics of gunnery, the intricate dance of the battle line, and the stoic endurance of the armored citadel. Aviation was seen as a flimsy, unreliable stunt, a job for daredevils, not for serious naval officers. The prevailing doctrine, held as sacred gospel, was that carriers were scouting vessels. Their job was to find the enemy fleet so that the battle line could engage in the glorious, decisive gun duel that every navy trained for and expected.
The idea that the carrier's aircraft were the primary weapon was heresy. No one learned this lesson more harshly than the American Brigadier General Billy Mitchell. A passionate, abrasive, and visionary advocate for air power, Mitchell was convinced that the battleship was obsolete. To prove it, he arranged a series of tests in 1921, bombing the captured German dreadnought Ostfriesland. The Navy, furious and deeply insulted, did everything it could to sabotage the test, setting rules that limited the number and size of bombs. Mitchell ignored them. His bombers first bracketed the ship, then scored direct hits with increasingly heavy bombs. Finally, a flight of Martin MB-2 bombers dropped 2,000-pound bombs near the hull, whose underwater concussive force acted like a torpedo, cracking the ship's seams. The unsinkable dreadnought rolled over and sank. The admirals were not convinced. They were humiliated. They called it an unrealistic, rigged test and buried the results. For his relentless, insubordinate advocacy, Billy Mitchell was court-martialed in 1925, his career destroyed for the crime of being right too soon. His disgrace set back American naval aviation by a decade. But a few officers, like the American Admiral William Moffett, and most critically, a cadre of brilliant Japanese naval architects and strategists, saw the future. The first true tremor of the coming earthquake struck on November 11, 1940, at the Italian naval base of Taranto. The British, desperate to neutralize the powerful Italian fleet which was strangling their supply lines in the Mediterranean, launched a daring night attack conceived by the brilliant Admiral Andrew Cunningham. The weapon was not a fleet of battleships, but a single, modern armored carrier, HMS Illustrious, and its 21 ancient-looking fairy swordfish torpedo bombers. These string bags, fabric-covered biplanes with open cockpits, were so slow a family car could outpace them. They were obsolete the day they entered service, yet in the darkness over Taranto, they became giant killers. Modified with special wire cutters to deal with barrage balloons and using torpedoes specifically adapted to run in the harbor's shallow water, they skimmed just above the waves, guided by flares dropped by other swordfish. In 2 waves, they achieved what the entire British Mediterranean fleet could not. They put 3 Italian battleships out of action for the cost of 2 aircraft. The world was stunned. The Japanese naval attaché in Rome studied the attack with intense interest. He and his superiors saw not an anomaly, but a perfected blueprint. That blueprint would be refined, scaled up, and unleashed on a scale the world could not imagine 1 year later. On December 7, 1941, 6 Japanese fleet carriers, the Kido Butai, the most powerful and experienced naval strike force on the planet, launched 353 aircraft in 2 waves against the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The attack, planned by Commander Minoru Genda, who had closely studied the Taranto raid, was a masterpiece of planning and execution. The target was the heart of American naval power, Battleship Row.
Within 2 hours, 5 American battleships were sunk or sinking, their broken hulls resting in the harbor mud. By a stunning stroke of luck, America's 3 Pacific carriers, Lexington, Saratoga, and Enterprise, were at sea delivering aircraft to outlying islands and escaped the carnage. Inadvertently, the Japanese had destroyed the old fleet and left the United States with no other choice but to fight the coming war with the new one. Admiral Chester Nimitz, arriving to take command amidst the wreckage, knew that his only real weapons were now his 3 carriers. The age of the battleship had ended in fire and twisted steel.
The new rules of this terrifying new form of warfare were codified in May 1942 at the Battle of the Coral Sea. It was the first naval battle in history where the opposing fleets never laid eyes on one another. The fighting was done entirely by aircraft at ranges of over 100 miles. It was a messy, bloody, confusing affair, a series of long-range aerial jabs where both sides struggled to find the enemy. The Americans lost the carrier USS Lexington when a bomb strike caused fuel vapors to ignite in a catastrophic secondary explosion. But in exchange, they sank the Japanese light carrier Shoho and, crucially, so badly damaged the fleet carrier Shokaku and decimated the air group of the Zuikaku that neither would be available for the next decisive battle. It was a tactical loss for the U.S. in terms of tonnage sunk, but a clear strategic victory as it halted the Japanese seaborne invasion of Port Moresby. More importantly, it was a brutal classroom. The lesson was clear. The carrier that found and struck the enemy first won. This new reality would reach its terrifying climax 1 month later, in a battle that would decide the fate of the entire Pacific War. Midway. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, assembled the most powerful fleet in Japanese history to seize Midway Atoll and lure the American carriers into a final, decisive battle of annihilation. His force was overwhelming. 11 battleships, including the mighty Yamato as his flagship, 8 carriers of various sizes, and over 150 other warships. The Americans, by contrast, had 0 battleships available. They had only 3 aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the Yorktown, the latter hastily patched up in just 48 hours after being severely damaged at the Coral Sea, with work crews still aboard as she sailed into battle. But the Americans had a priceless secret weapon. In a windowless, stuffy basement in Hawaii, known as Station Hypo, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of brilliant, eccentric codebreakers had done the impossible. They had cracked the Japanese naval code, JN-25. To confirm the target was Midway, they had the garrison broadcast an uncoded message that its water purifiers were broken. Days later, they intercepted a Japanese message stating that AF is short on water. They knew Yamamoto's entire, overly complex plan. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the first American attacks were a disaster. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, flew to their deaths in a suicidal act of bravery, following their leader's solemn vow to press the attack no matter the cost. All 15 of their obsolete TBD Devastator aircraft were shot down by swarms of Japanese Zero fighters. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating wounded in the vast ocean to witness the rest of the battle. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that attacked that morning from all 3 carriers, 37 were destroyed. They failed to score a single hit.
Aboard the Japanese flagship Agagi, Commander Minoru Genda and Admiral Nagumo watched the slaughter, convinced of their superiority. But the doomed heroic torpedo planes had done something crucial. They had pulled the Japanese combat air patrol, their protective screen of Zero fighters, down to sea level. And even more importantly, they had forced Admiral Nagumo into a fateful moment of indecision. His planes were returning from their strike on Midway, and he had to decide whether to rearm his next wave with land attack bombs for a second strike on the island, or with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes to attack the American ships that had just been spotted. In a fateful decision, he ordered his crews to rearm for the ships, a chaotic, time-consuming process that left his hangar decks littered with stacks of ordnance, snaking fuel lines, and fully fueled aircraft. It was at that exact moment of maximum vulnerability that Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, flying on little more than fumes and instinct, appeared overhead. What happened next was one of the most decisive and dramatic 5 minutes in military history. The Japanese carriers were helpless. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading his section, put his 1,000-pound bomb squarely into the middle of the Agagi's flight deck, striking the Rising Sun insignia. It crashed through to the hangar and detonated among the fully fueled and armed aircraft. The result was a catastrophic, instantaneous chain of secondary explosions that tore the heart out of the ship. Aboard the carrier Kaga, 4 bombs struck home, turning the ship into a raging inferno. On the Soryu, 3 bombs were enough. At 10:20 a.m., the Japanese fleet was the undisputed master of the Pacific. By 10:25 a.m., 3 of its finest fleet carriers, the veterans of Pearl Harbor, were burning, helpless wrecks, their decks peeling back like sardine cans. Later that day, American planes found and sank the 4th and final carrier, the Hiryu, after she had launched a desperate, valiant counterattack that doomed the USS Yorktown. The Japanese had lost 4 of their 6 first-line fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and over 3,000 men, including more than 100 of their most experienced and irreplaceable pilots, an asset they could never replace. The Americans lost 1 carrier. The mighty Japanese battleship force, including the Yamato, sailed helplessly nearby, their colossal guns silent, their crews watching the smoke on the horizon, utterly irrelevant to the battle that had been decided 100 miles away by a handful of brave pilots and the brilliance of a few codebreakers in a basement. Midway wasn't just a victory. It was a brutal, bloody vindication. While Japan, a nation with a limited industrial base, struggled to recover from the devastating, irreplaceable losses at Midway, America's industrial might kicked into high gear. Henry Kaiser's shipyards began building ships with prefabricated sections, launching escort carriers in a matter of months. The United States didn't just replace its losses, it buried its enemy under an avalanche of steel. American shipyards built 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, each capable of carrying nearly 100 state-of-the-art aircraft. They also built 9 Independence-class light carriers and an incredible 122 escort carriers. Japan, by contrast, managed to build only 4 large carriers in the same period. To counter the nimble Japanese Zero, American factories produced over 12,000 F-6F Hellcat fighters, a machine designed specifically to exploit the Zero's weaknesses. It was rugged, heavily armed, and powerful, a machine so effective that it achieved a 19-to-1 kill ratio. The war of attrition was one Japan was mathematically, industrially guaranteed to lose. The final pathetic act for the battleship came during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in human history. In a desperate last gamble, the Japanese sent the Yamato and her sister ship Musashi to attack the American landing forces. On October 24th, in the Sibuyan Sea, the Musashi was spotted by American carrier aircraft. Over the next 5 hours, the superbattleship, designed to be unsinkable, absorbed an incredible 19 torpedoes and 17 direct bomb hits before finally capsizing and sinking, taking over 1,000 of her crew with her. Her sister, the Yamato, survived, and in the now legendary battle off Samar, it stumbled upon a small group of American escort carriers and destroyers codenamed Taffy 3. For a moment, the old world returned as the Yamato's massive 18.1-inch guns fired for the first and only time at enemy warships. But the insane courage of the vastly outgunned American sailors in what became known as the last stand of the tin can sailors, combined with relentless air attacks from the jeep carriers, drove the most powerful battleship ever built into retreat. Commander Ernest E. Evans of the USS Johnson charged the Japanese line, his 5-inch guns spitting defiance, posthumously earning the Medal of Honor for an act of suicidal bravery that helped save the fleet. 6 months later, on her final suicide mission to Okinawa, the Yamato was met by nearly 400 American carrier aircraft. She was hit by at least 11 torpedoes and 6 bombs and sank without ever getting within 200 miles of an American ship, her magazines erupting in a mushroom cloud that could be seen for 100 miles. Her sinking was the battleship's funeral pyre, a final violent testament to its obsolescence. When World War II began, the world's navies measured their strength by the number of battleships they possessed. When it ended, the battleship was a historical relic, a museum piece. The new measure of power was the carrier battle group, a concept that dominates naval strategy to this day. The shift was one of the most sudden and complete technological revolutions in the history of warfare, a lesson written in fire and steel from the placid waters of Pearl Harbor to the depths of the South China Sea. The old admirals had been wrong. The age of the gun was over. The age of the wing had begun. And the sky, not the sea, was now the ultimate high ground in naval warfare.